Back to Ladies Can We Talk with Debbie Georgatos on 660 AM The Answer.
And welcome back. I told you we'd be back just before you know it. And we have in studio with us tonight a candidate for United States Congress named Russ Ramsland. He's running for the Congressional District 32 here in the great state of Texas. And, you know, we were talking at the beginning of the show tonight about this is the truly most I don't even know what word to use, unusual and high consequence election season for the presidential candidates and really for Congress too. There's so much going on in our country that is off track, that needs correcting, that people feel fearful about. And so these elections matter a lot. And so I want to talk with Russ about, he's running for U.S. Congress, and there is actually an incumbent, as I was asking the last hour, there's an incumbent in this seat right now, Pete Sessions, and he's been in Congress, I think, 20 years.
20 years, yeah.
20 years. So you're challenging an incumbent Republican. Why are you doing that, Russ Ramsland?
Well, I think when Pete went there 20 years ago, he probably was a conservative. In fact, I supported Pete up till about 2008. But the problem is that Pete now sort of represents Washington to us, not us to Washington. And you see that. In the 5 leading conservative scorecards, Pete averages a D+. Now, no other Dallas area congressman is down in that territory. In fact, all of them are A's and B's, with the exception of Jeb Hensarling, who's a C+. So Pete's record has just gone off the cliff.
So, you know, some of our listeners may be aware, but many organizations, especially, they have, for example, groups focused on being pro-life or focused on being pro-Second Amendment. These are organizations with a particular mission, and they rank how much the congressmen support that mission. So when you say Pete is, I actually did not know that he was down in the D+ world. So what issues has he gone off track, or how do you see him no longer really representing the people in our district?
Well, if you look, well, for one thing, he doesn't live in the district anymore. I mean, his tax home is in Winter Park, Florida, and he does have a place here, but he doesn't really live here. In fact, it's interesting because his wife, driver's license and voter registration is in Florida. So, as one guy asked me, he said, you know, if his wife isn't voting for him, why should I?
There's a point. Yes, he did. He actually remarried a few years ago to a woman who's from Florida. That's right. Yeah.
That's correct. And, you know, his travel records, he now submits them only in blocks so that you can't see whether he's traveling back here or whether he's traveling to Florida on his travel stipend.
Wow. You know, one thing that, and many of our listeners probably know this, but there's a very powerful position in Congress, a powerful committee called the Rules Committee. And Pete Sessions is the chair of the Rules Committee. And that committee essentially has almost indescribable amount of power in essentially making the rules that will eventually either allow a particular bill to go to the floor or not to go to the floor. So you may have a fabulous bill and some congressman you just love came up with an idea and wanted it to go and be voted on, but it has to go through the Rules Committee, and that committee over the years has developed many arcane procedures that allow the committee to simply prevent bills from going to the floor or not. So this is some people would argue, well, gee, you've got the chairman of the Rules Committee from your district. You don't want to take a guy like that out. What's your answer to that?
Well, my answer to that is, you know, it's kind of like one of the mayors around here asked me. He said, well, Russ, you know, Pete Sessions got 20 years. He can really bring home the bacon. You'd be a new guy. How in the world are you going to bring home the bacon? And I said, well, Mayor, with all due respect, that's the wrong question. You've forgotten it was your bacon. And you should not be asking, who do I want to go grovel in front of to get my own bacon back? You ought to be asking, who in the world is going to help me keep all my bacon or most of it to begin with?
I love that answer. You know, it's an interesting thing, too. I did not attend. There was a recent function in this area, and I did not attend, but my friend did, and was talking about how because Congress, this currently sitting GOP-controlled Congress, passed an omnibus bill in December that funded much of government all of government through September 2016, that Pete Sessions was giving answers to this audience saying, well, you know, they were saying, why can't you do this? Why can't you stop this? And he said, well, it's kind of out of our hands now. It just had the sense that the omnibus bill allowed everyone in Congress to say, well, we no longer can control anything because it's already been voted for. It's kind of like they gave themselves the excuse.
Yeah, Pete has basically helped surrender the power of the purse, which is really the control that Congress has on an out-of-control president. And so they put these 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 page bills out on the floor. Nobody's read them. They give them very short time frames. In the case of the omnibus bill, they only had 40 hours to read it. With all the pages of that bill, you would have had to read a page a minute for the entire 40 hours with no sleep, no food, no bathroom breaks, no anything. And they fully funded Obamacare. They fully funded Planned Parenthood. They fully funded the Department of Education and Common Core, although they gave it a new name. It's now called College and Career Ready Standards, so you won't know it's Common Core. They fully funded the Office of Syrian Refugee Resettlement and even added $100 million to it so they could bring in more of them that are unvetted totally. And they blew up the sequester caps by a further $80 billion. And this is supposed to be conservative leadership. And I'm going, wow, if this is winning, I wonder what losing would have felt like.
That actually raises a good point, because you do hear the argument that we have a Democrat president who's, in his last term of his year of his second term, and he's been pretty unwilling to compromise or negotiate. He just says, here's what we're going to do, and I want it. And so a lot in the GOP say, well, what are we supposed to do? So, the president, he wants this. He's done these executive orders. He's created executive amnesty. We have no power to stop him. So doesn't that seem antithetical to the notion of the balance of power, or separation of power in Washington? And then what is someone like Pete Sessions supposed to do when the president won't negotiate, won't work with Congress, just demands his way? What are they supposed to do?
Well, this is a partly self-inflicted plan of the Republican leadership. They shouldn't be giving the president an omnibus spending bill that they start on 5 days before the end of the year so the president can just veto one bill and claim something about them. They should have been starting 12 different bills on the first day of the session, one for each department, and those would progress up through subcommittees to committees, out onto the floor through a very regular set of rules, and they could be debated at length, et cetera, and then one by one they go to the Senate. The Senate does the same thing, and then about 6 months into the session, all these bills begin to head toward the president's desk. Now he's got 12 bills he's got to deal with. He can't just veto one and send it back to them. So that's what's called regular order, and that's why they threw out John Boehner, is because they wanted to get back to regular order.
Okay, I was just watching the clock here, which I'm not that good at doing, but are you able to, we're talking with Russ Ramsland, who's running for United States Congress and Congressional District 32 here in Texas. Can you stay with us through a break?
Sure.
Okay, so we're going to zip off to a break, a really fast break, and come back, and I have my Hey there, welcome back to Ladies Can We Talk. Thanks for tuning in. We have in studio tonight, we are speaking with Russ Ramsland. He's running for U.S. Congress in CD 32, Congressional District 32. And I will say to our listeners very quickly, it's really easy if you don't pay attention to politics to walk into the voting booth and look at the list of names and say, gee, I think that's our guy, isn't it? That's the name I recognize. And what happens with that is you perpetuate the incumbent, and it may not be the best choice. It's really a great privilege to be able to vote, to be allowed to vote. And I urge you to take the time, look and see who's running and find out what they stand for. So we have Russ and Carrie and Lori, my leading ladies, are going to chime in a minute. But Russ, tell our listeners how to find out more about you and your campaign.
Well, they can certainly go to the website, which is www.ramslandforcongress.com, or they can go to our Facebook, same name.
And Ramsland is Ramsland. Ramsland for Congress.
Ramslandforcongress.com.
Yeah, I urge you to go and check this out, because you know what? You can't unvote if you just, so be informed. So I have Carrie and Lori here tonight. I think Carrie's going to go first. I can't see her where we're sitting.
Yeah, sure. Hey, Russ, I just wanted to know, we get frustrated sometimes when we send people to Washington, D.C. They run on a certain promise and they get there and then they cave. Do you have an idea as to why that happens, and why will you be different?
Well, I think the reason that it happens is after you stay there for a while, if you want to get into leadership, the Republican leadership, unfortunately, is really kind of okay with big government. They just object to the label that's running it. So for them, it becomes a question of how do you raise enough money for them to be able to take over and run it. And of course, that gets you to the lobbyists. And once you get to the lobbyists, particularly people like the National Chamber, you end up with a set of priorities that simply aren't our priorities.
Can you name one of those for me, just out of curiosity?
Well, amnesty and open borders is one of them. And, you know, people don't understand the issue with amnesty, but there's really 4 problems with amnesty. First, it's a very powerful magnet. And so it encourages illegals to continue to flood the country, which makes our border security even more difficult to achieve. It also presents an ongoing national security problem because ISIS has already said we're going to be among those guys. And right now, they estimate about 30% of the people crossing the border illegally are from the Middle East. If you offer amnesty and now they stay here to form sleeper cells and lone wolf terrorist cells. The next problem with amnesty is it places a tremendous hardship on our own working poor and our own middle class who are paying taxes, and yet the illegals are getting free health care from those taxes. They're getting free schooling, et cetera, and then our working poor and our middle class are having their wages driven down in the competition. So that's really unfair. And then the last thing is that it enables voter fraud. The amnesty deal enables voter fraud because a lot of them now are getting driver's licenses, et cetera, and it's really hard to tell.
Russ, I'm so glad you made that explanation, gave that list, because I think especially for women voters, the idea of amnesty or, friendliness about immigration and kind of soft immigration policies, it seems like something you do out of compassion, that you just care about people and you want to help people. But it's a really important idea to focus on. I love that you went through that list, that if you love your fellow citizens, you need to recognize the impact on your fellow citizens, your fellow Americans, who actually were born here and have the right to be here, when you have an amnesty policy that allows people who, have come here illegally and they're taking jobs. It does matter. And so it's not the compassionate thing to support amnesty, ladies.
No, absolutely.
Okay. Okay, my question is political also. We worked very hard to finally get rid of Speaker Boehner, and we finally did. And we replaced him with Speaker Ryan. And he passed the omnibus bill. So my question is to you, when you are brought in and to the Capitol Hill and you're up there in Congress, will you vote for Speaker Ryan to be the next speaker for the next session?
At this juncture, I would have to say no. Unfortunately, I think...
Woohoo!
Well,
that deserves a woohoo!
Well, he came in promising a return to regular order, but we haven't seen that. We didn't see it in the Every Student Succeeds Act, and we didn't see it in the Omnibus Bill. And this Every Student Succeeds Act is a very, very bad bill, because what we did is, most folks don't realize that No Child Left Behind authorization, congressional authorization, lapsed at the end of George Bush's term. So the Congress has been letting the president continue this on for 6 or 7 years with actually no congressional authorization. And now they gave him authorization through 2021. That's into the second term of the next president. Wow. And it really does embed Common Core deeply into the system. It professes to give states an option, but when you examine what that option is, it's not something that the states will ever be able to achieve or do.
Excellent. Thank you.
So it was kind of a fake. I mean, it was a head fake.
It really was. Absolutely.
The other things, we can talk about lots of issues, but I think one other big issue that bothers Americans is just the basic growth in the size, scope, breadth of the federal government. And it's really very self-perpetuating. You'll hear people in Congress say, well, we can't do anything about the EPA. I mean, they've got the authority, so they can do this, they can do that. And the president, and especially if we have a Democrat in the White House, they love expanding government. So what can Congress do to rein in those agencies and ultimately work towards shrinking the size of federal government?
Well, Congress has huge power to rein them in. For instance, in the original EPA authorization, they were never given the right to regulate greenhouse gases. That came through the Supreme Court. And so they should go back and simply rule that that is not going to be allowed for the EPA, and they should defund that. Mm-hmm. They've got the power of the purse. Read Madison's Federalist Paper 58. He says it's the most powerful weapon with which any constitution can equip the representative of the people, and yet they refuse to use it. So there is lots they can do. They can put riders on their bills. They can, all sorts of things, and yet they don't do that.
Russ, why do you think they're not using the power of the purse? What's the reason behind that, do you think?
Well, I think they got a lot of lobbyist money not to.
Okay.
That's the fact of the matter. And the truth is, when Pete came there, we had a $5.5 trillion debt. Today, we have approaching a $20 trillion debt. So it's quadrupled. In fact, I got a flyer from Pete the other day that talked about how he was really going to turn towards doing something about this national debt. And I'm going, wow, 20 years? That's perfect. Thanks so much. But the fact is, we have to address the debt, we have to address the spending, and we have to address taxes. And we shouldn't be addressing them as three disparate items. We ought to be pulling together a full strategy. And it might look something like this. If we hold congressional spending by law, and then I would love to see it as a constitutional article, to about 15 or 16% of the gross domestic product, now we have suddenly aligned Congress's interest with our interest, because they don't get any more dollars to spend if they don't pass pro-growth policies. So it totally changes their incentive system, and it aligns them with ours. Today, they don't have that incentive. Today, their only incentive is to see how many feathers they can pluck from the golden goose without getting too much hiss. And they don't really care about the health of the goose.
Mm-hmm. Could you keep the cap of, like, if you find a percentage, 15 or 16%, is there any guarantee that another Congress wouldn't come and just raise that?
Well, that's why I'd like to see it as a matter, really a constitutional amendment. That would be safer. For sure. But, in this country, there's something called Heller's Law, and what it really says is that we generally collect about 19% of the GDP every year. And so this would give us something not only to grow the economy, but it would also give us something to start paying down the national debt, which we need to do because, as my 11-year-old a couple of years ago figured out, she owes $155,000. And it's going to take her, she babysits at $5 an hour. She figured out she's going to have to work every single night for the next 28.3 years. And I didn't have the heart to tell her she forgot about taxes in order to pay that off.
Right.
And what we've allowed these people to do is just ridiculous. And that's really what got me so mad and decided I was going to get in this race.
Yeah.
We are about a minute and a half to the end of this segment, so I do want to give you another chance. We're talking to Russ Ramsland, who's running for U.S. Congress, Congressional District 32, right here in the great state of Texas, North Texas. Again, just tell our listeners how to find more about you.
It's www.ramslandforcongress.com, RAMSLAND forcongress.com.
And we are right now in the midst of early voting. So if you haven't voted yet, this coming week, you can go for early voting. There are many, many locations that you can go to for early voting. And then our actual primary day is Tuesday, March 1st. It's a precious gift we get to do voting in this country. We get to choose our government, and we need to not waste it. So Russ, thanks for coming in.
Great. Thank you all so much. I've really enjoyed it.